Hello and hi. I am back today. We're getting toward the end of class. And I'm here to talk about chapter 10, well, module 10, sorry. And it is called the controversial science of behavioral addiction. So we're going to get into what are behavioral addictions. And without further ado, okay. All right, module 10 objectives are, which we're going to talk about just objective 1 in this particular video, are to discuss how the concept of addiction has changed over time and how behavioral addictions fit with evolutionary and neurobiological explanations. And then in the next video, we'll talk about forming arguments about why behavioral addictions are controversial, what are the issues there, and then we'll compare and contrast some of the intended and unintended consequence of labeling behaviors as addictions. So first, let's talk about how the concept of addiction has changed over time and how behavioral addictions fit with these evolutionary and neurobiological explanations. So first, I want to get into just the concept of addiction in general, and then we're going to work our way down to behavioral addiction. So addiction is an evolving concept. It has changed quite a bit over time. We've talked about before in this class that there was an old idea that you had to have tolerance and withdrawal, and those were crucial for diagnosis. Modern times, now the diagnosis, as you remember, of substance use disorder does not require tolerance or withdrawal. Those are symptoms, and they might be there or they might not be there. So it's not required. So that's a big change in the way we view addictions. We've also talked about other old ideas that have changed. For example, substance use used to be considered to be a poor choice done by immoral people who were trying to buck the system. And then another old view was that there's a singular focus on the disease model, that it's just a disease, that's all it is, it's a brain disease, and this person is not responsible, but there's basically a physiological process going on. But in modern times, we view substance use as a learned behavior, much, much more. A behavior that is regularly rewarded, and because it's rewarded all the time, we get all these social rewards, we get these rewards of a good feeling, a high, and it's an immediate reward. It's very, very powerful for forming a habit. So these are ways in which our conception of substance use and addiction has changed over time. Now we're faced with another enormous change in the field of substance use, and that is the concept of the behavioral addiction. So what is a behavioral addiction? It's when there's no substance there's no alcohol, there's no drugs, there's no anything like that. We become addicted to a particular behavior. And I know you use this in regular conversations, because I do too. I just say, I'm addicted to Instagram, or I'm addicted to TikTok, or whatever. Those are the concepts of behavioral addiction. So we'll talk about those. So first, what is a behavioral addiction? It's a compulsion to perform a rewarding, again, we get that learning in there, drug-free activity despite harmful consequences. And again, this is drug-free. Now, there's harmful consequences to it, as there are for every disorder in the DSM. Those consequences may be psychological harm, for example, depression, anxiety, physical harm. Bad things are happening to your body, maybe because you're sitting around playing video games all the time, and that's not terribly healthy. Financial problems can happen. You can see here with my example here of gambling disorder in the figure there, that we've got a whole bunch of financial problems there, social problems, marital problems, etc., 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 bad relationships. Well, what are the important features of this? Number one, a preoccupation. There's an over attention, a craving, a thinking about it when you're not doing it, a getting upset when you're not doing it. There's a compulsion, a perceived inability to reduce that behavior. Now, whether you're really unable to reduce the behavior doesn't really matter, but you feel like you are unable to reduce the behavior. You might have tried to stop the behavior and you couldn't stop, or you started again, and then harm. Doing it despite negative consequences. So if you took something like your addiction to TikTok, if you got one, you might find that you get a kind of preoccupation, a kind of craving for TikTok, right? You got lots of attention to TikTok, like things. Oh my gosh, my phone just went off. I have a notification. Compulsion. If you've tried to stop it, but you keep going back to it, or you've tried to limit it, but you keep going back to it, and then harm. You're doing it, and in doing so, you've perhaps neglected your schoolwork, and now you're dropping out of school or something like that. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the Mental Disorders, which is named the DSM. That is in its 5th revision right now. And so remember, it keeps being revised and revised over time. And over time, it keeps adding more and more disorders. And disorders also change. Well, there have been some changes to substance use disorders in the DSM over time. So let's take a look at the DSM-4. So there was a disorder, a class of disorders in the DSM-4 that was called substance-related disorders. Now, notice, it has to have a substance in there. And it included only the substance use disorders that we've been talking about in this whole class. There had to be a substance. Then in DSM-5, the class name was changed, and now it's called substance-related and addictive disorders. And those addictive disorders now include, well, it's really only one, it is gambling disorder. That's the only one that's in there now. So it includes all the substance use disorders we've been talking about: marijuana use disorder, opiate use disorder, alcohol use disorder, and all those, and also one behavioral addiction, and that is gambling disorder. Now, you may ask, was gambling disorder not in the DSM-4? Well, it sort of was. It was called at the time pathological gambling, but it wasn't with substance use disorders. It wasn't classified together. It was in a totally different section, and that section is called impulse control disorders. And it was under an area of impulse control disorders called impulse control disorders not otherwise classified. So it was in the DSM-4, but it wasn't with substance use disorders. So the putting it with substance use disorders really recognizes the similarity between the behavioral addiction and the substance use. Okay, so you might ask, well, what about these impulse control disorders? What are those? And I'm going to answer that, but apparently not until the next slide. I thought it was coming, but it wasn't. Okay, first let's look at gambling disorder and look at some of the criteria for gambling disorder. So this is the DSM criteria for gambling disorder, DSM-5. And again, that's in with substance use disorders and addictions. Okay, so persistent and recurrent problematic gambling behavior leading to a clinically significant impairment or distress, as indicated by the individual exhibiting 4 or more of the following symptoms in a 12-month period. So just like all the disorder categories, they list a whole bunch of symptoms, and you only have to have a certain number of them, in this case 4, in the last year. Okay, let's take a look at what those are. Needs to gamble with increasing amounts of money in order to achieve the desired excitement. And there we sort of see that tolerance concept coming in. Again, it doesn't have to be there because I don't necessarily have to have number 1 to get 4 of them. Is restlessness or irritable when attempting to cut down or stop gambling. That's where we see that sort of preoccupation, right? They're thinking about it a lot and getting irritated. has made repeated unsuccessful efforts to control, cut back, or stop gambling. There you see the compulsion there, is often preoccupied with gambling, having persistent thoughts of reliving past gambling experiences, handicapping or planning the next venture, thinking of ways to get money with which to gamble. So it's, again, that preoccupation. Often gambles when feeling distressed. This is harm, helpless, guilty, anxious, depressed. After losing money gambling, often returns another day to get even. We call that chasing. Lies to conceal the extent of involvement with gambling, has jeopardized or lost a significant relationship, job, or educational or career opportunity because of gambling. There again, you see that harm concept. Relies on others to provide money to relieve desperate financial situations caused by gambling. Now, sometimes gambling binges can go on when a person is in a manic episode of bipolar disorder. So it should be distinguished from that. So there it is, 4 of those in the last 12 months. So again, gambling, pathological gambling used to be an impulse control disorder. And instead of calling, they've moved it now to the substance-related and addictive disorder. So I want to take a look at what the difference is there between those two areas. So the idea here that distinguishes those, and it doesn't distinguish them perfectly, believe me, is that substance-related and addictive disorders involve actions that generate pleasure or generate reward. So we take a drug and then that makes us feel good. Or drinking is going to give us this social reward of being with friends or things like that. That's that pleasure motive. Impulse control disorders are sort of defined as doing actions to reduce distress. So the person is very, very upset and then has to do this action to reduce distress. Now that's still reinforcement, but it's not positive reinforcement. It's negative reinforcement because you're taking something away. You're taking away the distress. So these kinds of disorders are feature trouble controlling one's emotions and trouble controlling one's behavior. So those are things like kleptomania, which is stealing, pyromania, lighting fires, intermittent explosive disorder, just blowing up intermittently, just in an out of control kind of way. Well, it's not a perfect distinction. And so I want to just talk about that for a minute. A lot of times with substance use, it's the drug is no longer providing a whole lot of pleasure. And I think we've talked about this before in this class. Sometimes we're doing it to get rid of a bad feeling. And so in that sense, it's very similar to doing something to reduce distress. So that's why I have a little question mark there, because, the idea here is that sometimes substance-related disorders are actually the substance is taken to reduce distress. So that's not a perfect distinction. Also, impulsivity is a feature of both disorders, and impulsivity is highly correlated with both disorders. So consequently, as you would guess, comorbidity between these classes is really common. So people with impulse control disorders often have substance-related disorders and vice versa. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about evolution and addiction. There's evidence that when we look at the behavioral addictions, for example, let's take gambling, which is a recognized addiction, right? Gambling addiction, if you look at gambling and gambling related cues and you run fMRIs and you look at the brain response, what you see is a really similar brain response where we're getting, prefrontal cortex activity, we're getting reward, these reward centers, nucleus accumbens and things like that. You're going to activate the same kinds of reward pathways that are activated when a person does drugs. And that can happen from gambling. And presumably, I'm sure you've heard from social media and things like that, right? So one might ask, well, okay, well, why do we even have these reward circuits in our brain and what are they for? The idea there is that our brains have evolved this because they were helpful for survival. They would help us to eat and they would help us to reproduce. So the idea here is that if you felt a lot of okay, so take a look at that bottom picture there. So we got these hunters and gatherers, and this is way back in evolutionary time. And they're out, hunting and gathering, and they find this fruit tree that's like full of fruit, right? Now they eat a piece of fruit and experiencing that pleasure, that highly caloric food for a hunter and gatherer. That's pretty caloric, right? Because it has a lot of sugar in it. Fruit does. Now it makes sense to just eat and eat and eat and eat and eat and eat and eat, right? Because back in those times, it was hard to find food. Okay. Now we've got this problem, which is that all kinds of highly caloric food is super, super, super duper available. So now you have this situation where we still got these old timey brains that are telling us if you run into something like this, covet it, eat it, get as much as you can of it. And now we got the top picture, right? Which is what our brains are wanting that. So we can think of from an evolutionary standpoint that essentially our brains never really caught up with modern day availability of food, of drugs, of sex, pornography, technology that really, works to get us hooked. And now all this stuff is plentiful. Our brains haven't caught up with it. Our brains this is the concept that sort of our brains get hijacked by this stuff because our brains weren't really built for a world of plenty like this. They were built for a world of scarcity. Okay, next time we'll cover objective 2. You guys have an awesome day.